Hi everyone. I'm waiting for people to pop over. Hello. Um, Welcome to day 3 of the 5-day crochet challenge. And hi everyone. People popping over already. Hello. Welcome everyone to day 3 of the 5-day crochet challenge. I can't believe we're halfway through now. We only got 2 more days left. But day 3 was all about gauge, and yes, it's a topic that people either love or hate. It's a bit of a Marmite thing, isn't it? You either love it or you hate it. But hopefully, people are joining me today to have a chat about crochet gauge and really understand what it is and why it's so important to invest perhaps 10 minutes into creating a gauge swatch before committing to a much larger project, and then realizing that if you didn't make a gauge swatch, maybe realize halfway into the large project that it's not working out the way you intended it to. And yeah, so let's just take those 10-15 minutes to work up a gauge swatch before committing to a large sweater or cardigan project. And we're going to talk more about gauge today. And I've got some familiar names popping up in the comments. Good morning, lovely Julia. It's amazing to have you here. And we've got hello from Stacey Ann. Hi. Hello, everyone. I was expecting a bit of a crickets today. Maybe people weren't going to show up for the gauge talk, but I'm so glad you guys did, and that shows to me that you guys are willing to learn and hopefully are willing to do your gauge swatches before committing to bigger projects. And a beautiful comment from Julia. I did an amazing job with the gauge course. Thank you so much. I work super hard on convincing people to do their gauge swatches, to start their projects with just investing that little bit of time into creating that little square of the crochet fabric that you're intending to make into a bigger project like a sweater or cardigan, because those kind of like 6 by 6 inches of crochet fabric, that little piece of fabric tells a story, and it gives you a lot of information that you need to know before you commit to a larger project. So as usual, if you do have any questions, if you wanted to check on some information from the video lesson, or anything we spoke about before or on day 1. So day 1, we were talking about how to choose the right pattern, how to measure our bodies, and how to choose the right size of the pattern. We were talking about ease. We've got positive, negative ease, or no ease. On day 2, we were talking about materials yesterday. So we had a really in-depth lesson on substituting yarn, how to read the information on the yarn ball band labels, and how to find more information if you need to find more information about the yarns. We got Google, we've got the yarn manufacturers' websites to go and have a look at some more information. And then we calculated yarn amounts. I had a couple of messages yesterday saying, wow, you blew my brains, but it's not as hard as it seems. So people kind of rewatched the video a couple of times, and it was making much more sense. The more they watched it, the more sense it was making. And day 3, we're here today talking about crochet gauge, and we've got a really good point from Julia. Thank you for pointing that out, Julia. Perhaps I didn't mention that in the video lesson. So check your gauge during a project, because the tension changes depending on the mood of the crochet. Absolutely, that's spot on, Julia. Thank you so much for adding that in. That's definitely true, because even just down to watching Netflix, sometimes when I'm watching Netflix, meaning I'm looking down at my crochet project, but sometimes you kind of something catches your attention and you suddenly look up, and if you can crochet without looking, it's certainly just that little change can completely change your tension. And as I said, the tension on the very edges of the fabric, so your very first few stitches and very last few stitches, it's where the concentration changes slightly. So the first few stitches are kind of okay, you make the starting stitch, and then the first few stitches just before you get into the stitch pattern, you kind of concentrate a little bit more, and then you work through the middle of the row, and then the very last few stitches, I often, especially when I'm working on like a plain fabric that there is no like anchors in the row, if you get what I mean. So if you've got row that is made up of different stitches, you kind of if you've got like a combination, so say you've got 10 half double crochet and then like a bobble stitch, another 10 half double crochet and a bobble stitch, so those bobble stitches to me are like kind of like little anchors in a row, and I know, say from the last bobble stitch I should have 10 half double crochet, so you can count from your anchor in a row. But especially when I'm working on a plain row, so as an example, if it's just straightforward half double crochet row, when I get to the last few stitches, I'm thinking like, okay, have I got enough stitches? Is this right? Have I made enough stitches? Did I catch every single stitch? So those last few stitches, I kind of concentrate a little bit more. And also, if you're working into the top of a beginning chain, so you go like chain 3 from the previous row, it's always a bit like, okay, where do I place this very last stitch? So the concentration changes on the first and the last few stitches. So that's a great point, Julia. Always check your gauge during the project. And like you said, it depends on the mood, of course. Sometimes you're happy, so you kind of might crochet a bit looser. Sometimes when we're a little bit anxious or a little bit frustrated, you can just crochet a bit tighter. So definitely just pop that gauge measure, that square hard material gauge measure, just pop it onto your project and just double check that you're still within kind of one stitch within the gauge that you needed to reach. Julia, not enough coffee. A little typo always lurks in. Don't worry. I'm pretty sure there is some little typo somewhere in the course, despite my best efforts to catch everything and check everything numerous times. But sometimes I can't remember how the saying goes. Is it I can't see the trees for the wood? Is that the saying? Did I say that right? When you're kind of looking at something for so long and you're trying to check all the little details, you're kind of losing the whole track. So yes, don't worry, we'll supply you with coffee, Julia. We'll get there. And we've got something from Amber here. You can make an in the round gauge swatch 6 by 6 inch if you strand the yarn across the back so that you are always starting each row from the same side. Okay, yeah, that's a good point. Yes. So you kind of go back to the beginning of the row. So, well, round. I know what you mean. I can't quite explain that now. So you kind of work across, and then you just pull the yarn long enough so your swatch will lie flat. So you need to allow plenty of yarn to go around the back and to kind of loop back to the first stitch. So yes, that's a way to do it. So then all the stitches you'll kind of have face in the same way, and they will be kind of slant in the same way because you will be working in round. So that's a little cheat way of doing it. But of course, I always say cheat way is better than no way when it comes to gauge, because I remember I posted the picture of Instagram. I might have to dig it out, but I posted a gauge swatch, or like the square gauge measure. And the way I did the gauge swatch, this was just for entertainment purposes, of course. So I made the gauge swatch that was kind of 12 centimeters wide, and then I just work up the height on one side to 12 centimeters height. So it was like an L shape. So it was like this. So you can still measure the amount of rows and the amount of stitches. It was like an L shape. It looked like L, But then when you place the square gauge swatch measure on top of this L, you could still count the amount of stitches on a full row and the amount of rows on kind of like the vertical piece of fabric that went that way, so like an L shape. So that was a cheat way, but as I said, I think I even put in a caption for the post that this is not the proper way to do a gauge swatch, but if this is the only way you're prepared to do a gauge swatch, then by all means, that's so much better than not doing a gauge swatch at all. So Amber, thank you for putting this information out there as well. If you want to make a round swatch and just run the yarn behind so you get back to the first stitch and work across the round or kind of like a row, so in the same direction this way, then by all means that's better than not doing a gauge swatch at all for your project that is worked in rounds. Okay, so thank you for that, Amber. That's brilliant, very helpful. And we've got hello from Catherine. Hello, welcome, lovely to have you here. And we've got, if you are close to gauge, can you adjust by using the appropriate ease to obtain gauge? I'm not quite sure I'm following what you mean by, as in make a different size. Would you mean make a different size of the pattern? So using the appropriate ease. Do you mean if you can meet the gauge, say, if you have a gauge swatch and you count your stitches and rounds and rows, and say your sweater will come out kind of like 20% smaller overall because you're 20% off on your gauge swatch, you could adjust it by making the neck size up. Yes, you could. You could. This sometimes it works, sometimes it might not work as well as you would have hoped. But just the ease to obtain gauge. Of course, if you have a sweater pattern that is designed with 10 centimeter positive ease, and your gauge swatch is coming out 20% smaller than the original gauge, then your overall finished sweater will be 20% smaller, which will then probably give you about 8 centimeters positive ease. Is this along the lines you were thinking of? Let me know, Catherine. Is this what we're Catherine put back into the comment, like adding another inch of ease if gauge too tight? Yes, you could, of course, but then you would have to be following the stitch counts for the neck size up, perhaps. Unless you want to adjust the pattern yourself and maybe add a few stitches to the width or a few rows to the length, of course. If you don't meet the gauge, you could adjust the pattern yourself. Of course, that would definitely work. But that's obviously, I want you to have the confidence to do that. But this is sometimes where people kind of go a little bit wrong. But if you want to add another inch of ease, you would probably then be looking at neck size up in the pattern grading. So you would have to make because when you make a neck size up, you would naturally be obviously adding stitches and adding rows to make the finished sweater bigger for bigger size. So if your gauge is a bit too tight, your bigger size measurements might actually end up being the measurements of the smaller size. Are you following me? I just went off like little thinking journey, but yes, there is definitely a way. This is how a lot of pattern designers perhaps started their careers, when they kind of grabbed the pattern and said, oh, this is not working out. So rather than struggling with meeting a gauge, I did that myself. I just kind of add inch here, add a few stitches here, add a few rows around there, and then it just turned into something that I was hoping to make. So, yes, I hope that was making sense. I hope I wasn't rabbiting on for too long. And we've got lovely Laura here. Hi, Laura. Good morning. This was so helpful. I'm often confounded by why my stitch gauge matches but not row gauge. There we go. So I think I said in the video about the rider, the yanker, and the lifter. But of course, if you are off with your row or round gauge, you will first start with changing the hook size, of course, because if you kind of like 2 rows out on your gauge, changing your stitches to lifter or yanker might not actually make up the whole difference. So you would perhaps then go up and down the hook size, but to change the way you pull up the golden loop would come in really handy if you are off by kind of like just a tiny bit, right? So I'm not talking like, you know, you're kind of half an inch out of your on your gauge swatch. This would be handy when you see, the thing is, you can change the size of the hook, but the size of the hook has to change so it kind of works for both stitch gauge and row gauge. Because I know this is something people struggle with a lot, that they have to go up or down a hook size to meet the stitch gauge. And once they kind of, so as an example, instead of 4 millimeter, they have to use 5 millimeter hook to meet the stitch gauge. But then the 5 millimeter hook still might not be big enough to meet your row gauge. But if you go, say, up to 6 millimeter hook to adjust your row gauge, it might completely mess up the stitch gauge, right? So to actually be mindful of the golden loop and the way you pull up the golden loop. This is handy when you have adjusted your hook size to meet your stitch gauge. And then when you're working up your rows around, it's still a little bit off. So this is when you can actually adjust the golden loop. So we've got a rider, which kind of sits alongside the tops of the stitches. We've got a lifter, is when the golden loop is kind of angled up, so it's larger than your original loop. And then we've got yanker, is when you've got your working yarn. I normally loop mine around my index finger. It's when you pull on your working yarn real tight that your golden loop, actually your hook slopes down, because the yanker means that you yank on the working yarn and make that golden loop really small and tight. Okay, so this is really handy to know when you adjusted your hook size for the stitch gauge and you're still slightly off on the row gauge. Okay, but one thing I was going to say is it's important to look through the pattern when you're making your gauge swatch, when you're trying to match the gauge of the designer. Like every garment is obviously constructed differently, right? You've got sweaters that are, say, worked from top down or bottom up, in which case, as an example, this cardigan as well. So it's just straightforward rows, okay? So to stick to the size, obviously your stitch gauge, so your how many stitches, is much more important than your row gauge, as I said in a video, because if you mess up your stitch gauge, the chest circumference, the finished chest circumference of your cardigan or your sweater will be messed up, and it will probably be too small, too tight, or too big, too oversized. So as an example, in this cardigan, because it's worked bottom up, your stitch gauge is much more important than your row gauge. Okay, because if you are not meeting your row gauge, there is always the possibility to just add a couple of rows, take away a couple of rows, and then you can easily adjust that. Okay, the other example is my sideways jumper. I wish I dug out the photo now. I'm gonna keep talking. I'm gonna try dig out the picture and share it with you. So with the sideways jumper, because as the name suggests, there it is. Oh, that was quite quick. Let me just bring up this picture. Can you see this? There we go. So this is my sideways jumper. Okay, so as you can see, the stitches, it's worked from your neckline down towards the waist and back up. So it's worked sideways, okay? So in this case, for this type of construction, your row gauge would be more important than your stitch gauge, okay? Because if you don't have enough rows, the width will be obviously altered. Of course, it will be easy to adjust and add a few rows, and of course, if the length is not matching either, you could add a few stitches, but that's when the pattern gets a little bit complicated, that you have to remember that you adjusted the number of rows and the number of stitches, because obviously everything else will then, all the other stitch counts will then be off. So your sleeve circumference, the number of rows, so your neckline would be different, where it says like pick up round the end stitch of the next 20 rows. If you adjusted the number of rows, that number 20 wouldn't correspond with your own pattern. So that's what I just wanted to point out, that something like my sideways jumper, because it worked in rows that run vertically, vertically from your neckline down to the waist, your row gauge is more important than the stitch gauge. Okay, if that's making sense. So yeah, this is what we need to think about when you're trying to match the gauge of any of the patterns. That of course both measurements or both numbers are important, but there is always one that is just teeny bit more important than the other. But of course, if you need to match both, but if you are really struggling with one of those, just look at the construction of the garment, and there will always be one, either the stitch gauge or the row gauge, that is slightly going to tip the scales in its favor, that it's slightly more important, and then the other measurement could be adjusted a little bit. Okay, so that's what I just wanted to point out, and I'm just going to go back through the comments here. And here we got a question from Catherine. If the designer doesn't give the stitch to use for the gauge, what stitch should you use? Okay, I would perhaps go and look at the start of the pattern. So I'm assuming, most, I'm not saying all, but most garment patterns would start with main body, I'm assuming, okay? Most, I'm not saying all. So you can then look at the finished garment, okay? As an example, for this cardigan, I would concentrate on the gauge of the main body stitch pattern. So you would then have to go ahead and just chain X amount of chains that is going to be large enough to cover 6 inches. 6 inches. So chain as many chains you need to go to 6 inches, and then just start following the main body pattern and just work up the gauge swatch that way. Okay. It would be very strange not to actually specify what stitch the gauge was measured over, but my best guess would be that you would obviously have to concentrate on the main body stitch pattern, because as I said, sleeves and things like that, you can always kind of tweak a little bit, or best thing you could do is perhaps reach out to the designer and ask, could you just please confirm what stitch was the gauge measured over? Was that the main body, the sleeve, or whatever other parts of the pattern there are? Sometimes it would be very unusual, but you do have those general gauge or general tension on the yarn ball band label. So you could look up that tension on the yarn ball band and just perhaps see whether that tension would be something that the designer used in the pattern, whether that would work. But honestly, if there isn't a stitch specified in the gauge swatch, I would reach out to the designer. I would just ask them, could you please confirm what stitch you used for your gauge swatch? Because committing to a project like a garment, which is quite a large project, without doing a proper gauge swatch, it probably would be a waste of time. It's not one of my patterns, is it? Gosh, did I forget? But yeah, or maybe, just maybe, that would be an indicator that you could actually just choose a different pattern. Maybe the pattern is not quite up to scratch. Maybe if there is a stitch missing for the gauge swatch, you would have to then question what else is missing from the pattern. Okay, so I would. It could be an honest human error. It could be an honest mistake. Honestly, I remember before, I'll tell you this quickly. I remember before I published a pattern, I was so proud of the pattern. Everything was in there, and I went over the board, schematics, sketches, and video tutorials, and close-up photos, and step-by-step photo tutorials. And I was so proud of this pattern, and I hit publish. And within the first hour, people that bought the pattern have messaged me, would you please have the yarn quantities for other sizes apart from the medium? And I was like, oh my God. So it could be an honest mistake, as it just got missed off the pattern. Because honestly, I published my pattern with all the singing and dancing of video and photo tutorials, but I forgot to add the quantities for the different sizes. So it could be an honest mistake. Like I said, best bet would be to ask the designer directly, and just go from there. Okay. And here we go, Julia. I don't recommend this for anyone else, but for me, I don't worry if my row gauge doesn't match. I just add or subtract rows in the body portion, learned over many years of crocheting. That's right, Julia. Of course, as I said, if it's constructed kind of top down as a raglan or bottom up as like this cardigan, it's easy to just add a couple of repeats of the rows if it's just coming up a little bit too short. It's a great way to start your little journey of adjusting crochet patterns and really making them to your particular size, because some people are all torso, some people are all legs. So the standard length of the body measurements that we can find on the Yarncraft Council website, they are standard body measurements, right? But whose body is standard? Okay, I'm no Victoria's Secret model. So even down to me, like I always, when I'm designing sleeves, when I look at the Craft Yarn Council website, the sleeves are anything between 42 to 45 centimeters. But honestly, 42 or 45 centimeters, as you can see, on my arms are nowhere near, right? So I kind of, because this was scrap yarn project as well, I did not have enough yarn to finish full length sleeves anyway. So I'm kind of passing these ones off as a 3/4 sleeves, right? But if you measure them, they are about 42 to 43 centimeters, which, as you can see, is far too short for me. I prefer my sleeves when they kind of come down to about here. I like them quite long. So as you can see, yeah, you can easily then, I design the pattern to the standard body measurement, but if you need to add a few more rounds onto your sleeve or take away a few rounds of your sleeve or the main body, by all means, go ahead and do that, because at the end of the day, it's going to be your sweater, your cardigan. You want to wear it. So go ahead and go and adjust it. Here we go. I imagine that pattern repeats are also important for gauge. Yes, of course. Sometimes gauge is set over, especially with lacy patterns. If you've got a combination of stitches to create like an open lacy fabric, telling you that 10 double crochet should measure 10 centimeters, it's not impossible. So then the designer would normally say that, as an example, 2.5 pattern stitch repeats should measure 4 inches. So this is another way that gauge could be written out. As an example, my Minac wrap, so it's like the Ripley pattern, it's the wavy pattern. That pattern repeats over, I believe it's 12 or 14 stitches. So it's not, those 12 stitches don't cover 4 inches. So what I did was kind of like 1.5 pattern repeats should measure 4 inches. Okay, just as an example, as the top of my head, that's probably not the proper amount, but as an example, any like a ripple patterns or chevron patterns or anything like that, they would be easy to list as a pattern repeat, because kind of like a chevron will go up and down like that. So to tell you that 10 double crochet measures X amount of inches is probably not going to helpful, because your stitches are going to go up and then they're going to come back down. So it's also easier to kind of say the stitch pattern repeat. So maybe 1.5 chevrons or 1.5 ripple repeats measures X amount of stitches, X amount of inches, right? There we go. Another tip from Julia. For those who are worried about using too much yarn making a swatch, you can unravel the swatch at the end of the project if you needed a little more yarn to complete it. Absolutely. Absolutely. I know some designers, well, I personally add 10% extra onto the yarn quantities that are required in the materials list. This is to account for any differences in tension and for you to make your tension swatch as well. But of course, if you are running low on yarn and if you think, okay, I probably just need a few more meters, a few more yards, then by all means unravel that gauge swatch and you can use it in a project as well. Okay, let me just look through the comments. And we've got Laura. Years ago, I broke my left ankle. Now leg swells. I deliberately use half a size bigger hook needle to allow for that. And I think this is continued. Nobody but my leg notices the difference between the two socks. Fantastic. There we go. You don't have to adjust the pattern. You can just change the hook size and the whole thing is just that little bit bigger to allow for the little bit of swelling on your leg. So this is the beauty of gauge. This is why gauge is so fun, guys. Come on. So yes, that's a very, very good way of adjusting small pattern like socks or gloves or hats. Rather than messing around with the stitch repeats and with the construction of your sock or hat or whatever you're making, you can actually change the size ever so slightly by changing the hook size. So that's a great use of gauge, Laura. That's brilliant. Right, so I'm just gonna pop up this QR code for you. So this is the VIP ticket. If you scan this QR code, it'll take you to the page to grab. If you are joining us, if you just found us on YouTube or Facebook, wherever you joined us from, we are doing the 5-day crochet challenge to get you making your first garment. So over the next, we've got 2 more days, but we have been talking about a lot of different topics, which are directly aimed at beginner crocheters to get into garment making. So we've been talking about choosing pattern, measuring bodies, ease, materials, substituting yarn, calculating yarn amounts. We were talking about hooks and measuring tools yesterday. Today we're talking about gauge, and we have just watched the video lesson all about gauge. That is still available on YouTube. So if you want to rewatch it a couple of times, it's still available for you to do so. If you wanted instant access to tomorrow's materials and Friday's materials and access to all the previous video lessons from Monday, Tuesday, and a full access to my crochet gauge mini course, which is also included in the VIP ticket, then scan this QR code, go and grab yourself either the free ticket Or if you want all these perks and all these extras, grab the VIP ticket. It's going to be available until the end of Friday for the early bird price, but after the Friday, it's going to go up to the regular price. So it's a bargain to grab it now if you were thinking about this, if you wanted to have access to all these extra perks. So I'm just going to quickly run through these materials here. So as I said previously, the VIP ticket will actually give you access to my Crochet Gauge Basics mini course. It's not mini, it's only called mini because it concentrates on one topic, which is crochet gauge. But it goes in depth all about crochet gauge, and we've got the slideshow here as well used for the video. We've got lots of written materials and help, kind of visual help as well here. As you can see, there is a lot more to day 3. If you do have the VIP ticket, you can see that day 3 is full on, because in my opinion, gauge is by far the most important thing to really understand and really get right when it comes to crocheting garments. And here are all those little cheat sheets and all that extra little help that we need when we go adjusting the stitch and row gauge. So you've got a handy graphics in there that you can actually download to your device, save it, and you can refer to it anytime you want. This is our live Q&A that's happening right now. And here we go. You can download your materials. So in the mini course, you also get access to Crochet Gauge Handbook. So this is the handbook that you are free to download and keep inside the VIP members area. And as you can see, there is a lot of pages with all materials and everything explaining to you what the gauge is all about. And we also have, this is the crochet gauge cheat when I was talking about the video. This is available in the VIP members area. So this is very handy to just download to your device and refer back to if you ever get a little bit confused. I've got fewer stitches, that means big, so you need a smaller hook, or you've got more stitches than the gauge swatch, which means the stitches are too small, so you need a larger hook. And then we go on to row and round gauge as well, because it's easy to get confused. Of course, sometimes, the basics you have had in your head, sometimes they go a little bit off. Sometimes you're thinking, okay, well, why am I not remembering what I remembered yesterday? That's just how it goes. Okay, so that is everything that is included in the VIP area of the 5-day crochet challenge that is running live at the moment. And we've got another great point from Amber. I'm just going back through the chat comment section. You guys are amazing showing up today. Thank you so much. And Amber, a gauge swatch can also be used as a patch pocket for a sweater if you don't want the yarn to go to waste. Just sew it on your sweater at the end. Amazing idea. Of course, absolutely. That's absolutely a great idea. You could actually start with making a gauge swatch and then using it as a pocket at the end. That's a really good idea. So that kind of gives you that mentality that you're not wasting time, that you're already making a part of your sweater, you're already making a part of the jumper or cardigan, and you can use it as a gauge swatch to start with and then just pop it on as a pocket. Amazing idea, Amber. Thank you for sharing that one with us. And yes, Julia, that's absolutely right. Gauge swatches are also helpful for checking the drape if you are substituting yarn. Absolutely. This is what we spoke about yesterday when we were talking about substituting yarn, that the best way to just double check how the yarn you have chosen to use instead of the original yarn, the best way to check how it's going to behave, how it's going to withhold, how it's going to show the stitch pattern, Some yarns are great at showing us stitch patterns. Some yarns are absolutely awful. They just completely, the stitch pattern completely disappears in certain yarns. So the gauge swatch is absolutely amazing to check your drape, check how it kind of stretches widthways, how it stretches lengthways, whether it's going to be stiffer, whether it's going to be softer. And you can also do the wiggle test, of course, when you just hold your gauge swatch by the corner and just give it a little wiggle. We were speaking about wiggle test when we did the Crochet Garments with Confidence Summit with Hannah from Hanjan Crochet. So wiggle test is a legitimate thing, people. It's one of the steps in a process. You just hold your gauge swatch and give it a wiggle and see how it behaves. Kind of like, has it got drape? Does it move? Is it going to be stiff? Is it going to be comfortable? So wiggle test is a legitimate step in a process of garment making. So don't skip that one. And yes, we've got a lot of yeses for Amber's idea here from Julia and from Catherine. Never thought of that. What a great idea. So if you perhaps haven't learned anything, at least we've got some great ideas here from Amber, how to use your gauge swatch as a pocket. So that's amazing. And I'm just going to pop this QR code back up for you guys. If you just found us randomly on any of the platforms we're currently talking on, this is what we're doing, 5-day crochet challenge. Come and join us. And yeah, I wanted to share a quick story. Actually, I just looked in my notes and I remember that I dotted down a little story. Years ago, I'm talking years ago, when I picked crochet back up, I found a beautiful jumper in Simply Crochet magazine. It was this beautiful kind of Fair Isle style where it had all colorful yoke. And obviously, I wanted to make it. And not knowing any better, I just grabbed yarn that I had to hand and I started making this sweater. And to say that it was not working out was total understatement, because later on, as I found out about gauge, of course, I had a discussion in one of the Facebook groups. It was a crochet Facebook group, and there was a talk about gauge and tension and adjusting the gauge and adjusting the tension. And I was kind of reading all these comments thinking, what is this? And then obviously I did my research, and then I realized why my Fair Isle jumper I wanted to make for myself would probably be just about big enough for a kind of like 4-year-old child. And the other mistake I did, and I made another boo-boo when I started this pattern, it was that I just grabbed random yarn. Okay, and when I then checked what the yarn was, it turned out that I was using DK weight yarn, but the pattern was originally using a worsted weight yarn. Okay, so that's how I went about learning about yarn substitution and about crochet gauge. But that is exactly why we are here doing this 5-day crochet challenge, because I don't want anyone else to just randomly grab pattern, be really super excited thinking, oh, I'm going to make this for myself, and then only get disappointed because it's not working out. And maybe you don't even know why it's not working out. But that's what inspired me to put this challenge together for everyone. So if you've never made a garment before, as I said, come and join us for this 5-day crochet challenge, because we're going over the process step by step. So I've tried to do this challenge in kind of like a chronological order, or in the order that I would expect people to go about starting a crochet garment. So, you might do the process a bit more randomly, but I just felt like this is the way that I would go about starting a crochet garment if I was learning from scratch. Okay. And the other thing I wanted to share with you actually is I did a little live interview with Caitlin from We Crochet. It was last Wednesday, and we were talking about gauge when we were in the backstage, and we were talking about gauge, and Caitlin actually started knitting a sweater. And she then realized that it's not working out, the size is not working out. And what the problem actually was is that she hasn't noticed that the gauge swatch in the original pattern, the gauge was measured over 5 inches instead of 4 inches. Okay, so she was meeting the gauge, what she thought, but her gauge was over 4 inches, but the original pattern was measured over 5 inches. So let's learn from this as well. Always check the size of the area that the gauge is measured over. Of course, I would say most of the patterns use 4 by 4 inches or 10 by 10 centimeters, but sometimes whether it's the size of the gauge swatch might be adjusted by the designer. Maybe it's to accommodate for that extra stitch repeat that is needed to finish the whole pattern repeat. So they would set the tension over 5 inches, or sometimes they set tension over 2 inches. So always check the whole gauge. So check how many stitches, how many rows or rounds are measured over what area, because that can change sometimes as well, the area that the designer has measured for the swatch. It could be 4 by 4 inches, it could be 5 by 5 inches, or 2 by 2 inches. So that's just what I wanted to point out. Before we finish today, I'm just quickly looking at my notes because I made a few notes. And I had a comment actually that this gauge information is good for knitting as well. So I'm not a very good knitter, so I'll take your word for it. But I suppose, it's stringing yarn together with whatever tools we have, whether it's knitting needles or hooks. So I suppose the information kind of overlaps for both of the crafts. Okay, so if there are any more questions, pop them in the comments. If there aren't any more questions, I'm pretty sure that I have covered everything that I wanted to cover. And hopefully, I'll just quickly flick through the comments, but I'm pretty sure that hopefully I called them all. Whether any of them popped up while I was looking at the other tabs on my computer. No, I think we're all good. So I think we answered all the questions, and yeah. So if you guys haven't got any more questions for me, I'm gonna sign off for today. So that's the day 3 of the 5-day crochet challenge done. The crochet gauge basics video will still be available over on YouTube for the next few hours. But if you wanted lifetime access to all the materials from day 1, day 2, and go ahead and jump onto day 4 and day 5, the VIP ticket is your best bet. It's going to be at the early bird price until the end of Friday. Then it's going to jump to the regular price. So don't miss out if it's something you've been thinking about. If you're finding this helpful, and if you're finding that you would need to rewatch some of the videos over and over as well, then by all means, go ahead and grab the VIP ticket. And we've got a lovely thank you from Laura. Thank you so much. I have learned so much in these 3 days. I am so glad you said that, Laura. Thank you so much. That is why I'm doing this 5-day crochet challenge, because I want people to learn and to have the confidence to crochet themselves a beautiful and well-fitting garment the easy way. Because as I shared the story previously, when I was sewing my jacket, it was painful. It was a painful journey. I did get through it, but I don't want crocheters feel this way. I want crocheters to just have a resource they can refer back to when they get into garment making, and go over all the basics that we need to think about with garments. And we've got a lovely Julia. This Q&A was great. Thank you, Julia, for showing up. and Laura and Catherine and everyone, Stacey and whoever else popped into the comments. Thank you so much for joining me. I was a little bit apprehensive today because I thought, oh, Gage is a bit of a funny topic. Is anyone going to show up to the live? But you guys have shown up for me. Thank you so much for joining me. That's the day 3 of the 5-day crochet challenge done now, and we're looking forward to day 4. So tomorrow we're going to go over reading a crochet pattern. Okay, so we're going to talk about all those different little bits and pieces we can find in a crochet pattern. What do they mean? All those asterisks, those brackets and parentheses and repeats, and all the different bits in the pattern. We will have some uh, garment pattern specific terminology, so we'll be talking about right side, wrong side, right shoulder, right hand side, left hand side, and what do we actually mean by all this. So we're going to make sense of all those terms that we use in garment patterns, because sometimes they can be confusing. And then actually in the video lesson tomorrow, I have got one row of one of my cardigan patterns, and we're going to go over this row together. So we're going to read the row together, and we're going to go over those little repeats and what do they mean and how to repeat things. And yeah, it's going to be great. I'm hoping that you guys are going to join me tomorrow for reading a crochet pattern challenge tomorrow. So thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed today, the video lesson and the live Q&A. The replays are still available on my YouTube channel, so go ahead and rewatch if you need to. And I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow for day 4 of the 5-day crochet challenge. If you haven't grabbed your ticket, this is where you need to scan this code or click any of the links in the description for this live. Go ahead and grab yourself a free ticket or upgrade to the VIP ticket. And nothing else left to say, but to say a huge thank you for everyone who joined me for the live Q&A today, and everyone who watched any of those video lessons this week. You've been absolutely amazing, and I can't wait to see you all again tomorrow for another live Q&A right after the premiere of the video lesson at 12:30 UK time. And I'll be popping live on YouTube, on Facebook, in my Facebook community group again tomorrow. So thank you so much again, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow.